Thank you for the invitation, Sam. As always, it's always a pleasure to come here to Westside and speak to you guys. It kind of feels like a second home sometimes. I've been here so much. I've certainly enjoyed it. I hope you do too. We're going to make some progress tonight. We, white humanists, my white humanist brothers and sisters, we're going to talk about race, right? And we're going to talk about race, and it's going to be colorful. Because race is colorful. We're going to talk about a lot of different colors. And we might get a little uncomfortable tonight. That's all right. We'll get through it. So the evolution of racism. This talk actually is commemorating Darwin Day, right? So Charles Darwin was born on the 13th the 12th of February, along with Abraham Lincoln, actually born on the same day as Lincoln. And I'm trying only to tell you all about the contributions that Darwin has made to modern science, to our understanding of biology and how life came about, how life differentiates. At different points in his life, he had different experiences. I'm going to touch on some of those. And his legacy to us as humanists focuses primarily on what he's given us scientifically, which is tremendous, which is absolutely tremendous. But there's another aspect of Darwin. Another aspect that maybe we don't like talking about, we probably don't like thinking about, but there are some people that do like talking about, that do like thinking about, and do like bringing up quite often. And it's the question I want to deal with first here tonight. The question of, was Darwin a racist? And the answer, my friends, is yes. Darwin was a racist. So what does that mean? What does that tell us about Darwin? What should that mean to us? Well, one of the things that gets harped on quite frequently with Darwin is this word race, right? So if you look at The Origin of Species, this is the work that he contributed. He put this together. This changed the landscape of biology. The subtitle is On the Favored Races. Right? So he talks a lot in The Origin of Species about races, about certain races being better than other races. And in this book specifically, that word is not used at all with reference to humanity. In fact, he goes to great lengths in this book not to deal with the implications of his theory on humanity. Because he knew what he was introducing. By itself, the idea that humans may have evolved from other organisms, that in itself was so controversial, he didn't even want to touch that until he had fully fleshed out his theory and got people to sort of understand how it would work with the other organisms and all the other forms of life that we know of. But the next book he wrote, or the last great work that he wrote, is The Descent of Man. And this book does focus on the evolution of humanity. And you get to see quite clearly Darwin's views with regard to the races and what that means. Now, Darwin is very often quoted. He's very often, quote, mined, cherry-picked, and it's easy to take his words out of context. In part, it's his own fault. So Darwin, when he writes like a good scientist. He's always trying to show the weaknesses in his view and all these other alternative possibilities and other ways of explaining the data. So as he's writing his books, he's giving like the opposite side. He's sort of the devil's advocate. Well, you might look at it this way, or you might look at it this way. He doesn't really doesn't often take a stand. And that's to his credit as a scientist, right? He's giving you all the evidence and making sure that you know that he's looked at all sides. One of the few times when he actually does sort of stand on a pedestal here is when he's talking about the progression of man. He sees the evolution of our species as a progression, as sort of coming up out of lower somethings and progressing into a higher something. Now we know that in itself is a false idea. That's a philosophical teleology that's not actually supported by evolution. Evolution doesn't say that things go necessarily from lower to higher. They go in all sorts of different directions. Sometimes they go more complex, sometimes they go less complex. But we as humans, we suffer from a couple things. Number one, we suffer from our own egos. We want to believe that we are the best and greatest things that exist. Me personally, I feel that way. I'm sure you all do too, right? That you're the best. There's nothing wrong with you. It's everyone else's problem, right? If they can just get things figured out. So we as humans have a tremendous psychological investment in our own egos. And that extends to anyone else that's like us. And that extends to anybody else in our own species, perhaps. And so we see ourselves, and Darwin was no different from this. Darwin saw himself as part of the pinnacle of what it meant to be alive, to be a living creature. And so looking at that, from that vantage point, looking back, he's looking back at these other organisms, the other ancestral forms, and he forms this picture in his head about how things work. And I'm going to go ahead and read this whole thing because I hate when people quote mine, so I'm going to read this whole paragraph because it's very interesting. He's talking about what will happen when humanity eventually evolves so far that it sort of breaks apart even further from the rest of the animal kingdom. He says, "The great break in the organic chain between man and his nearest allies, which cannot be bridged over by any extinct or living species, has often been advanced as a grave objection to the belief that man is descended from some lower form. But this objection will not appear of much weight to those who, for general reasons, believe in the general principle of evolution. Breaks often occur in all parts of the series, some being wide, sharp and defined, others less so in varying degrees, as between the orang and its nearest allies, between the tarsius and the other lemuridae, between the elephant, and in a more striking manner between the ornithorhynchus or echidna and all other mammals." The echidna is the spiny anteater that lays eggs. "But these breaks depend merely on the number of related forms which have become extinct. At some future period," and here's where it gets interesting, "at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At this same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Hermann Schaffenhausen has remarked, will no doubt also be exterminated," which they're getting close. The gorillas, the mountain gorillas are pretty close to that. And then here's the key point. "The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as that baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla." Now, if the full weight of that hasn't yet been made clear to you, let me just demonstrate. This is what is going through Darwin's head. On one end of the scale, you have the baboon, and then the gorilla, and then the black man, and then the white man. And these exist on a scale of being less evolved and being more evolved over here. And what he is hypothesizing is, at some point, the gorillas might go extinct, and the white people might kill off all the black people. And when that happens, there's going to be a tremendous gap between the baboons and white men. Right? That is the way that Darwin saw humanity. He saw humanity as fitting on a spectrum, where whites were the pinnacle of evolution, and blacks were a less evolved, less advanced, more inferior version of humanity that we sort of passed along the way. That, my friends, is racist. Now, where did Darwin's racism come from? He didn't just come up with it himself. There'd actually been a long tradition of racist thought with regard to the human species, to humankind. Even as far back as the ancients. Really, any culture that we can look back on and have any sort of a glimmer as to what they thought about their fellow humans, we can see tremendous racism. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Chinese even, the ancient Egyptians. When the light-skinned Egyptians were in power, they said nasty things about the dark-skinned Egyptians. When the dark-skinned Egyptians were in power, they said nasty things about the light-skinned Egyptians. So racism is something, again, that is endemic to humanity. It is something within all of us. And we see it really start to come into crystal clear focus with this gentleman. If you don't recognize him, this is Carl von Linné, or Linnaeus, as he's known. And he was a categorizer. He liked putting things in boxes. He liked giving things names. And this is also something that is tremendously human. We like categorizing things. We don't like things being unable to fit in one box or another. We don't like ambiguity. We like it fitting in this box and having that label, and that's where it sits forever and ever. And so that's what he did. He went through the entire zoological record at the time. He went through all known animals and plants and humans. And he said, well, there's got to be some rhyme and reason to this. There's got to be some way of categorizing humans. And what he did was basically give a formal definition to the understanding of humanity that existed in the post-Enlightenment era. And he split the entire human species into 4 races, 4 types. Type 1, Europaeus albus, the white European. Type 2, Americanus rubescens, the red American. Asiaticus luridus, the yellow Asian. And Africanus niger, the black African. Now, if those don't make your skin crawl, in this day and age, they absolutely should. And if they don't, this will. Along with these categories, he also gave descriptions, because these are different species as he's categorized them. He gave them specific descriptions. And he said, this is what Europeans are like. Europeans are white, sanguine, they have abundant long hair, blue eyes, they're gentle, cute, very inventive, they like a lot of clothes, and their ways are regulated by customs. That's how they make decisions, is by their customs. That's what all white people do. The Americans, the Native Americans, they're red, choleric, righteous, black, straight, thick hair, stubborn, zealous, free, painting himself with red lines, and regulated strictly by customs. All Native Americans are like this. The Asiaticus is yellow, melancholic, with stiff black hair, dark eyes, severe, haughty, greedy, covered with loose clothing, and regulated solely by opinions. And the black African is phlegmatic, relaxed, with black frizzled hair, silky skin, a flat nose, tumid lips. Females are without shame. Their mammary glands give milk abundantly. They are crafty, sly, and careless, and they like covering themselves with grease, and they're regulated solely by their will.
What year is this?
This was 1753. 1753. So post-Enlightenment. But this is what he thought. This is how you describe these people. Right? And we read this, and this was a great scientist of his time. This is somebody that Darwin looked up to. Right? So again, all these things are going through our heads as we're thinking to ourselves, how did Darwin get so racist? Well, this is part of the train of influence that Darwin had. So that was Linnaeus, right? So that formalized how Europeans thought about the different races. And it was kind of gross, wasn't it? It's kind of, ugh. Well, it gets even more gross. So allow me to introduce you to Sarah Bartman. Sarah Bartman was captured as a child in South Africa in the 18th century Her parents were killed, her family was killed, probably the entirety of her tribe was killed. And she was captured and put into slavery, bounced around for several years until a Scottish doctor found her and thought she looked interesting, and sent her to Europe, sent her to England and France, and to be paraded in a human zoo. Europeans at this time paid money to come look at her. Now, they didn't come to look at her naked. She did have a certain degree of modesty. But eventually, they got tired of looking at her. And she died in her mid-20s, penniless, diseased, and without a friend in the world except for this gentleman, Georges Cuvier. I say friend a little bit sarcastically. He spent a lot of time with her. He tried to get her to take her clothes off for her because he wanted to draw those pictures of her. He wanted to see what she looked like, and she wouldn't do it. But she did die, and guess who got her body? This fellow. So he took this lady's dead body, drew all sorts of pictures of it, examined it, examined her genitals, wrote all about them. Out of curiosity, this is something, this is like describing a weird sort of stork, And this is his opinion when it comes to racial issues. He says, the white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity. So that's what he thought about white folk. Maybe he was just really generous. Maybe he just, felt really good about everyone. Well, no, not actually. This is what he said about black people. He said, the Ethiopian race is marked by black complexion, crisp of woolly hair, compressed cranium, and a flat nose. The projection of the lower parts of the face and the thick lips evidently approximate it to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which it consists have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. This was another great scientist, Georges Cuvier. Another great scientist. Now, he didn't really hold to the views on evolution, but he was a tremendously well-renowned and well-respected naturalist, and his opinion was sought after in all sorts of scientific questions. Now, Sarah Bartman's story is horrific. We look back on this and we think, how could that have happened? And we think, well, maybe, okay, it was the 18th century. It was the 18th century. People were not as advanced then as they are now. Well, let's bounce forward about 100 years, and we'll get a little closer to home. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this fellow. His name is Otabenga. And this picture was taken in the Bronx Zoo in the early 20th century. And this fellow was also, his tribe was attacked by Belgian forces in West Africa, and his family was killed. And he was sold into slavery. And he eventually bounced around a few places before somebody picked him up and said, this guy would be a great addition to a human zoo. And they sent him to the Bronx Zoo, and they set him up in the monkey zoo. And nobody at the Bronx Zoo, in the 20th century, nobody in the Bronx Zoo thought this would be a problem. It took the black churches in New York complaining about this and protesting this for him to be removed from that exhibit. And he also, after he was removed, died young and penniless and alone. So these are some of the things that white people have done in their sort of investigation into the nature of biology and human evolution. Now, we come to 2015. And this photograph was included in an email that was sent by the higher-ups at the Ferguson Police Department with the caption, Michelle Obama's High School Reunion. This is exactly the same sentiment, exactly the same idea that's floating around in these. We look back at these people 200, 300 years ago, and we think, how could they have been so backwards? This is happening today. The same racism that existed back then is still in our society today. And we also have this young lady, Zendaya Coleman. She's a young actress, does a lot of stuff with Disney, has up until recently had very straight white hair, but just recently decided to get dreadlocks and showed up at the Oscars. And we're not talking about right-wing racist cops. We're talking about the left-wing liberal entertainment media, all piled on her and criticized her for having strange hair. So on all sides of the political spectrum, there is racism flowing, there is racism at work in our society. We are swimming in it. And just a little bit to our north, at the University of Oklahoma, a particularly egregious example. Again, this is 2015. We have a black president. We have black justices on our Supreme Court. And black lawmakers, black mayors, attorney generals. But this is still happening, right? This is still happening. The fact that we have black leaders in our political institutions does not make this go away automatically. We're still swimming in it. Now, the young man that you saw there, where did he come up with that idea? Where did his racism come from? Right? We're still sort of struggling with Darwin's racism. Where did this young guy from in 2015 in the United States of America, where did his racism come from? Is it just him? Yes. Is he the only one? Let's look at the state of Oklahoma. So, the state of Oklahoma, overall demographics, is about 72% white, 7.4% black. At OU, the demographics, the racial demographics, are only 5% black. Among the faculty at OU, it's only 3% black. Let's look at these numbers specifically. See how they compare to each other. So again, this is Oklahoma. 7.4% of Oklahoma is black, but only 5% of the student body is black. Now that may seem like small numbers, sure, but when you look at the relative rates, you're 33% less likely to find a black person at OU than you are to find them just walking around the streets of Oklahoma City, or Normal. And you're 40% less likely to find a black professor at OU than you are to find a black student. This does not suggest to me that the system that exists in Oklahoma is one that is immune from racism. It seems like this is an example of racism in the system. One more look at Oklahoma. This is a breakdown of the ethnic demographics in the Oklahoma correction system, state correction system. 54% of people in prison in Oklahoma are white, 29% are black. Now you compare that again to the overall demographics, and there's a big difference. There are far more black prisoners in Oklahoma than there should be given the population. And there are far fewer black students in Oklahoma than there should be given the population. This is indicative that there is a systemic problem. This young man that we see on this bus wearing his tuxedo and chanting about how they'll never let any black people into his fraternity. That is a problem, sure. But that is a tiny little bit of the problem. Tiny. The real problem is much bigger and much deeper, right? We can expel him, sure. We can castigate him and make him apologize, but that doesn't make the problem go away because that's not the only problem. Right? And you think about the situation that that kid grew up in, and the racism that we still have here in our society, and now think about Darwin growing up. What kind of society did he grow up in? What was his life like? Maybe that can give us a clue as to why Darwin was racist. Right? So this is Darwin at 7 years old. He was a child of privilege. He was a child of so much privilege, it's hard for me to even grasp it. And I'm white. I have so much privilege it's coming out of my ass. Right? But Charles Darwin was the son of a wealthy doctor. And on his mother's side, they had tons of money. They were the Wedgwood family. So there was so much money. Charles Darwin grew up in this house. This house is 3 times bigger than my house. And I'm a grown man. And this was the house that he moved to. This was the house that he lived in. And what was Darwin's job? What did he do for a living? Does anybody know? Nothing is what he did for a living. He was wealthy. He had money from his parents, he had money from his wife's family, and all he had to do was whatever he wanted. Right? So Darwin lived in a lap of luxury. He lived in the United Kingdom, one of the wealthiest countries that existed in the world at that time. He had so much privilege that he could take a multi-year trip around the world like it was nothing. Just, oh sure, I'll just get on this boat. And he didn't even have a proper job on the boat. He was really only brought on the boat to keep the captain company. That was his only technical job. He was just there to sort of keep the captain company, because the captain, Captain Fitzroy, was also kind of a piece of work. He didn't like socializing with the guys who actually ran the ship. So he wanted another, educated, intellectual guy to talk with.
Gentlemen?
You might say gentlemen, yeah. They had their difficulties, though, Darwin and Fitzroy. So, one of the stories that Darwin tells, this is in his autobiography that he wrote much later in life. He wrote about an encounter that he had while they were in Brazil. He says, he and the captain had been fighting quite a lot. And he said, we had several quarrels. For when out of temper, he was utterly unreasonable. For instance, early in the voyage of Bahia in Brazil, he defended and praised slavery, which I abominated, and told me that he had just visited a great slave owner who had called up many of his slaves and asked them whether they were happy and whether they wished to be free, and they all answered no. And Darwin says, I then asked him, perhaps with a sneer, whether he thought that the answers of slaves in the presence of their master was worth anything. That's a nice line right there. That's clever. This made him excessively angry. He said that, as I doubted his word, we could not live any longer together. I thought I should have been compelled to leave the ship, but as soon as the news spread, which it did quickly, as the captain sent for the first lieutenant to assuage his anger by abusing me, I was deeply gratified by receiving an invitation from all the gunroom officers to mess with them. But after a few hours, Fitzroy showed his usual magnanimity by sending an officer to me with an apology and a request that I would continue to live with him. So this is interesting, right? So this tells us a little bit more about Darwin as well. This is kind of an interesting fact. Darwin was, what was he? He was anti-slavery. He was an abolitionist, right? So he was racist, but he also hated slavery. Is that possible? Yes. Yes. Right? You can take all the quotes you like about Charles Darwin, about his hatred of slavery, but he also thought that black people were lower than white people, and that is racist. Right? But he did. He came from an abolitionist family. I think on both sides they were mostly abolitionists, and he held those ideas himself. Although he never really stumped. He was not an activist. He didn't really do much work to try to get slavery destroyed, although he did give a lot of opinions in favor of its destruction. And in this letter he wrote, in 1833, even as a young man, he said, and this is, I find fascinating too, he said, "I have watched how steadily the general feeling as shown in election has been rising against slavery. What a proud thing for England if she is the first European nation which utterly abolishes it. I was told before leaving England that after living in slave countries, all my opinions would be altered. The only alteration I'm aware of is forming a much higher estimate of the Negro character. It is impossible to see a Negro and not feel kindly towards him. Such cheerful, open, honest expressions and such fine, muscular bodies." Ooh, that's a little creepy. "I never saw any of the diminutive Portuguese," that's also kind of creepy, "with their murderous countenances," very creepy, "without almost wishing for Brazil to follow the example of Haiti. And considering the enormous, healthy-looking black population, it would be wonderful if, at some future day, it does not take place." Okay, a lot of mixed emotions there. He feels very positive about black people, but he doesn't like those damn Portuguese with their murderous faces and their little bodies. And he hopes that the black people in Brazil rise up and kill as many Portuguese as possible in Brazil. That's what happened in Haiti. Right? So he's wishing for that to happen in Brazil. That's a little creepy too for me. But there was a lot of thought at the time, and as he was developing his ideas about evolution, and as he's leading up to the publishing of On the Origin of Species and the Descent of Man, there's still a lot of work being done looking at the human race. Right? Because there's all these ideas bubbling around, and where did we all come from, and how did we get there? And this map was put together. This shows the composition of the world by race, right? Where all the races are, where they live, what all their labels are. There are tons of these maps in existence, all sorts of different categorizations and classifications. This one, interestingly enough, was drawn up by Thomas Henry Huxley in 1870, just prior to the publication of The Descent of Man. Thomas Huxley, as I'm sure you know, was one of Darwin's best friends, and a fellow naturalist as well, and the fellow who coined the term agnostic. So all this is happening as Darwin is getting up to drafting and publishing The Descent of Man. And he's kind of struggling with this concept of where did human beings come from, right? So he does have this distinct view that white people are higher than black people, but there's an open question at the time. And this has been going on for years. Are all the human races that exist, no matter whether there's 4 categories, as Linnaeus said, or 13 categories, as Huxley had, did they all come from one original species, or did they all evolve separately as separate species? And it was an open question. Nobody knew. Everybody had opinions. Lots of people, Cuvier, for example, thought that black people had to have evolved separately. They could not be in the same species as white people, as Europeans. Even people that we admire, like Voltaire, thought that this made sense. And we're sure that black people could not be sharing our species, could not be sharing the European species. Right? But Darwin thought that all the human species probably came from some common ancestor, and he wasn't quite sure how to articulate that. And he talks about this in The Descent of Man. And as is typical for Darwin, whenever he's writing about an issue, he tends to write both sides of the same issue. So he sort of argues against himself here in the book. And so he's comparing the arguments. And he says, but the most weighty of all the arguments against treating the races of man as distinct species is that they graduate into each other, independently in many cases, as far as we can judge of their having intercrossed. Right? So humans can interbreed, and that is indicative of them being all the same species. And yes, they have tremendous diversity between all the different groups of humankind, but he says this diversity does not prove that the races ought not to be ranked as species, but it does show that they graduate into each other, and that it's hardly possible to discover clear, distinctive characters between them. And this is something that has been shown to be true, that there any characteristic, right? So all these stereotypes that Linnaeus gave, all the different races, those do not apply across the board. Right? Not all white people have blue eyes. Not all black people have curly hair, right? There's a wide variety that exists. And he mentions his own personal experience. He says, even though the American Aborigines, that's the Native Americans, the Negroes, and Europeans are as different from each other in mind as any three races that can be named, yet I was incessantly struck while living with the Fuegians on board the Beagle. These are people from the Tierra del Fuego and the Horn of South Africa. With the many little traits of character showing how similar their minds were to ours. And so it was with the full-blooded Negro with whom I happened once to be intimate. This doesn't mean that he had a black boyfriend. When he was in school, he learned taxidermy from a black guy, I believe he was African originally, who had gone on several of these sort of expeditions with naturalists and had learned how to do taxidermy. And he taught Darwin the methods of taxidermy. And Darwin remarked at the time of how very intelligent and very kind this guy was. Almost like it was a surprise. Like he didn't expect that, right? Because he didn't expect that. Right? Because of how he grew up and where he grew up. Now, the quotes that I've shown you sort of ameliorate a bit the opinions that Darwin had a bit, right? So the opinion that he states about white people being more advanced than black people, that is clearly racist. But he's clearly having trouble with that. That resolving those ideas are difficult for him, which is why he's going back and forth and back and forth. I don't know if we magically transported Darwin forward in time, whether he would have been able to become educated, would have had a much more progressive opinion, much less racist opinion. I hope so. Surely hope so. But of the scientists of that time, in the 19th century, if we're to be fair to the influences of science on racism, we can't just point our fingers at Darwin. Right? I've already shown you Linnaeus, shown you Cuvier, and now somebody that you might also know, Ernst Haeckel. So Ernst Haeckel is kind of famous because he did a lot of drawings of embryos in development. And he was very good at that. He was a very good drawer. He did a lot of things well, but he also screwed a lot up. He screwed up the concept that as embryos develop from point to point, that they actually go through different stages of evolution. He was sure that was the case. He even doctored some of his drawings to demonstrate that was the case. And science has effectively disproved him in that regard. So he is an example of a guy that got something wrong, even though he was an intelligent guy. But he was wrong about more than just embryos. He was also wrong about race. And here are some of his views on race. Very different in quality, if not quantity, from Darwin. He says, the Caucasian or Mediterranean man, Homo mediterraneus, has from time immemorial been placed at the head of all the races of men as the most highly developed and perfect. Now, from time immemorial, this is an indication that he believes that white people evolved differently from black people, that they were actually different species. So this was an idea that he had. And he said, this species alone, and he's talking about the white species, has an actual history. It alone has attained to that degree of civilization which seems to raise men above the rest of nature. Now, his ideas about development and how different species go through different periods of evolutionary development as the embryos grow, led to more and really more rabid racist ideas. And this thought that really the races are separate and they really represent different species led even to this drawing, which was published in Harper's Weekly. Again, in the United States, 1889, the end of the 19th century. This was the magazine for the upper crust. This was the magazine for society people, intelligent people. And it's showing the difference between Irish and German English and black people. And it's making the argument that actually Irish people are black. Now, that's pretty racist. To go so far as to make an argument that a white person is black. To want to paint them with that brush because you think that's the worst thing to do to them. To be able to justify your bigotry, when the common bigotry that was in existence at the time against the Irish. But you see how they've drawn them. They've drawn their profile so that the Irish fellow kind of has a similar profile to the black fellow on the right, whereas in the middle you get this, I don't know if I've ever seen a white person like that, but he's got this long sort of Roman nose and strong chin and very tall forehead. And yeah, so this is supposed to be the Anglo-Teutonic ideal. And so the argument that was made in this article said that the Iberians, this is the Irish, are believed to have been originally an African race who thousands of years ago spread themselves through Spain over Western Europe. Their remains are found in the barrows or burying places in sundry parts of these countries. The skulls are of low prognathous type. They came to Ireland and mixed with the natives of the south and west, who themselves are supposed to have been of low type and descendants of savages of the Stone Age, who in consequence of isolation from the rest of the world had never been outcompeted in the healthy struggle for life and thus made way, according to the laws of nature, for superior races. So this is they're describing Irish people in the same way that they described Sarah Bartman, in the same way that they described pretty much anybody else that wasn't European. Now they've put the Irish in this category too, right? So this is really blatant, right? When you're so racist that you're taking one category and putting it in a completely separate category, that is just over the top. But that's what happened, and that was a result of, in part, the ideas that Darwin came up with, but also very significantly, and Stephen Jay Gould makes this point in his book on ontogeny and phylogeny. He says that the ideas that Haeckel put out said that for anyone who wishes to affirm the innate inequality of races, few biological arguments can have more appeal than recapitulation, with this insistence that the children of higher races, invariably most of them, are passing through and beyond the permanent conditions of adults in lower races. Because if adults in lower races are like white children, then they may be treated as such, subdued, disciplined, and managed, or, in the paternalistic tradition, educated but equally subdued. Right? So this provides an argument as to why white people should treat black people and Native Americans and Hispanics and anybody else like they're lower people, because they didn't evolve far enough. They're not like us yet. And Gould points out that these ideas, these arguments spread widely and all over the place after evolutionary theory was promulgated. Even though there were similar arguments before 1859, when Origin of the Species was published, they began to be much more common after that point, and they increased by an order of magnitude. But all the data that were developed in order to try to prove this point were absolutely worthless. So that's where science led. Science led eventually to that point. And that sort of brings us here to, again, today, in the 21st century, where racism doesn't exist anymore. Because we're smarter than them, right? Because we're humanists. We know better. We're able to think through this. Right? Except when we can't. Because of who we are. Just like Darwin was limited by who he was, we are limited by who we are. I was limited by who I was 5 years ago. So this is in 2010, the Dallas Fort Worth Coalition of Reason put an ad on the side of the T bus in Fort Worth. It said, millions of Americans are good without God. We had a link to our website at the bottom. And we had all of our faces, everyone who wanted to be a part of this, all had their faces right there on the bus. And we signed the contract, it went out, and we thought, okay, we've done good here. Until we learned that the tea had been boycotted by a coalition of black ministers in Fort Worth. And I thought to myself at the time, what? What? And I read the news articles, right? So it became instant news, right? So at the, being an atheist, I guess at the time was still news, but having a bus campaign and having ministers line up against you, that was serious news. And so the Fort Worth Star-Telegram did an article, and they interviewed several different pastors. And I read the article and I thought, okay, I can figure out where they're coming from. And they interviewed a white Methodist pastor in downtown Fort Worth, and he said, we have separation of church and state, free speech, they're fine to do whatever they want. I said, okay. They interviewed a Baptist pastor, and he said pretty much the same thing. I said, well, okay, so what's the problem? Then they got to the representatives of the black ministers group. And he said, this is an affront, this is racist, and we want to stand for this. And I said, I don't get it. I didn't get it. I had no idea. And so I called him. Or I called his office and talked to his secretary, and I said, look, I'm with this group that put the ad, and I saw your article, I saw your interview in the newspaper, and can I come talk with you, please? I need to learn more, and maybe I can explain this better to you. I thought to myself, there must just be something that he's not getting. He's just, backwards. He just doesn't get it. And so I met with him, and I went to his church, and I sat down in his office. He led me in there, and I thought it was just going to be me and him. And I sit down, and I'm surrounded by half a dozen other black pastors. And they're all looking at me. And they're not happy. And I'm not a small guy, but I felt pretty damn small. And I talked about as fast as I could, and I tried to figure out, tried to explain myself and explain what we were doing. And I said, look, we were just looking for a different angle, and we did a billboard last time, and we thought this might be fun. And he said, who do you think these buses service? I said, I don't know. He said, these buses go through our neighborhoods, not your neighborhoods. We see the messages. And so it feels like you're targeting us. That floored me. Because we just wanted to get some news coverage. We thought maybe Fox 4 would do a story, and that'd be great. We did not expect to have a boycott. But I learned a lot about that. I learned a lot from that. And I learned that when I said I didn't get it, that wasn't a condemnation of them, per se. That was more a condemnation of me. I hadn't got it. Because I wasn't able to see things like they were able to see things. And that was kind of a hard lesson to learn. Alex Jules, who's over there taking photographs, and I wrote up our different experiences of this event, and he sees it very differently from the way I see it. And he had a different experience. He had all sorts of different pressures placed on him. We actually ended up, the two of us, going to this minister's church for Sunday service together. And I was the only white fellow in the room. Doesn't happen very often. But I can tell you that no eyes were on me when I was there, because they all knew that there was a black atheist in the room, and they were all focused on him. And that's a kind of an experience that I go into a lot of churches, and I've never had anything like that happen to me. It's very unique. And so what I learned was, I think maybe what Darwin might have learned if he had spent a little bit more time outside of England. When he came back from his voyage, he never left again. If he had traveled a bit and maybe learned a little bit more, I'm hopeful anyway that he would have felt differently about racial issues. But we're past Darwin. It's no longer the 19th century, it's the 21st century, right? And so these issues of race are still with us. God damn it, they're still with us. But that just means that we need to look really hard at ourselves. We need to look at what's around us, right? So these events that have just happened, right? The Ferguson, OU, these are things that are happening around us, but they don't quite feel close to home. But let's look at what is close to home. So this is a map of Fort Worth, South Fort Worth. This is from a website that's taken the 2010 census data and mapped all the different households by ethnicity. The white dots are white people. The green dots are black people. Orange is Hispanic, and the red is Asian. And you can see very clearly that South Fort Worth is not a melting pot. Right? There are white neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, and little enclaves of Asians all throughout. Everyone is all separated from each other throughout most of the city. Right? So you think back at the graphs I showed you about Oklahoma, and that looks like a system that is still suffering from racism. You look at this graph, this still looks like a system that is suffering from racism. Now, there is some hope. If you look right in the middle, you'll see that right here is us. This very building is right in the middle of this whole big mess, right at the nexus point between this whole, all these white neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods, and black neighborhoods here. You are in the perfect position to have an impact on your neighborhood. Just go outside your door. Right? So Juan was talking earlier about getting socially active. You do not have to go far. Right outside this door is where the Humanists of Fort Worth can start their business. You are ready to go. So, what should you do? How do you approach this? Here's some guidelines. This is some of the things that I've learned. I've tried to share some with you guys tonight, some of the stuff that I've learned over the years. As you're approaching this, as you're following Wanda's lead and getting socially active and beginning to make an impact in your communities, number one, acknowledge your limitations. Right? You are not going to get a lot of stuff. Take it from me. There's a lot of stuff that I don't get. There's a lot. And you're not going to get it, and that's okay. Those are your limitations. Step two, go outside your comfort zone. Don't just show up at the same old restaurant that you've been to a million times and everybody, loves the menu there. Go someplace that you've never been before. Go someplace in the orange area. Go someplace in the green area. Or in one of the red areas. If you're feeling comfortable, you're probably not in the right position. And number two, don't be afraid to let others lead the way. All right? And this is a hard thing for me too, because my instinct is to say, all right, something needs to be done. I'm just going to go up and do it. But I've had to learn this lesson too. Sometimes I'm not the right person to lead it. So make sure you find the right person to lead your efforts as you go into these different communities and you make an impact. Number four, don't be discouraged by failure. You will fail. White people have failed at race for hundreds of years. And you are not going to have a stellar track record when you get started either. But always hope for success. Because success is possible, progress is possible. You're not going to change the world tomorrow. You can't erase the legacy of Darwin. You can't make him not racist. You can't make the history of evolution into something that it's not. You have to accept that, but move on, acknowledge that it's bad, and say, we're going to do better. And that's what you guys can do, and I'm looking very, very much forward to seeing what you guys come up with. So, thank you very much for